All right, welcome to another deep dive. We're here to, really get into those sources that you're curious about.
Yeah, take all that curiosity and just sort of dive right in.
And today, I think we've got a really fascinating one. We're going to be looking at an article called Rationality as a Goal of Education. It's by David Moshman.
Yeah, a pretty interesting concept. I mean, we all want education to be more than just memorizing facts, right?
Right. So what is that more? What are we really shooting for? That's what this article is all about. And it starts by talking about these two big approaches to education
Hmm.
that go beyond just rote learning, the developmental approach, and then this focus on thinking skills. So maybe let's start with development. Like, what's the gist of that?
Well, the way I see it, the developmental approach kind of sees knowledge as something that grows from within the learner. It's not just about pouring information into their heads.
So it's more like, like a plant growing. And these are the right conditions, but it's got its own internal blueprint.
Exactly. It's about fostering those internal processes. And the aim of developmental programs is to facilitate this kind of global, long-term, internally driven process.
I see. The article gives some examples, right? Like Piaget's stages of cognitive development or Kohlberg's theory of moral reasoning.
Right. So it's not just about, catering to a student's current level or even just caring for their overall well-being. It's about aiming for this sort of fundamental transformation in their understanding and abilities.
Got it. And there are like two really key aspects to this whole developmental thing, right? This organismic worldview and then the endogenous basis for change.
You got it. So the organismic worldview, that's the idea that knowledge isn't just a bunch of random facts, but it's interconnected, like a living structure with systemic properties.
Like it's got its own internal logic and connections.
Exactly. The article uses a good example, the reversibility of arithmetic. The idea that addition and subtraction are kind of like two sides of the same coin. It's not just a rule you memorize. It reflects a deeper understanding of how numbers work together.
Right. You're getting the underlying structure, not just the surface stuff.
Right. And then the endogenous basis for change, well, that's basically saying that real, lasting learning comes from those internal cognitive processes.
From inside the student.
Yeah. And there are a couple ways to think about how those internal processes work. Like one is this nativist view, sort of like there's an innate blueprint driving development.
Okay. So kind of like hardwired in a way.
Exactly. But then a more common view these days is constructivism, where individuals are actively building their own understanding through their experiences.
So they're not just passively absorbing information, they're like actively constructing their knowledge.
Right. But even though the environment is super important in providing those experiences, developmentalists really stress that the driving force, the direction of that change, comes from those internal processes.
Interesting. Okay, so what are the strengths of this whole developmental approach? What does it do well?
Well, for one thing, it acknowledges those deeper structural considerations in learning. It's not just random bits of information, it's an interconnected system.
So it takes that complexity into account.
Yeah. And it also highlights these internal self-regulatory forces. The idea that we're not just sponges soaking up information, we're actively making sense of things.
And it emphasizes that active role of the learner.
Absolutely. And then, of course, we have these well-established developmental theories, like Piaget and Kohlberg.
Right, providing a sort of framework for education programs.
Exactly. So there's a strong theoretical foundation there.
Sounds pretty good. But, there's always limitations, right?
Of course. One big challenge is defining those developmental stages, like figuring out what exactly a student should achieve at each stage.
Right. It's not always that clear cut.
Yeah. And then there's the issue of choosing a specific theory, right? Because there are a bunch of developmental theories out there.
It's not just one size fits all.
Exactly. Plus, even the most influential theories, like Piaget's, have been, challenged and refined over time.
Like they're not perfect.
Right. So there isn't a single universally accepted model of human development to base education on. And then there's this really interesting point that Moshman makes. Just because something is a natural progression, it doesn't mean it's good or desirable.
Oh, that's interesting. Just because it happens naturally doesn't mean it's what we want.
Yeah, think about it. Humans might naturally develop in ways that we wouldn't consider ideal, like maybe towards more irrational or selfish tendencies.
Right. We might need to, guide that natural development in certain directions.
Exactly. And then one last thing. While developmentalists are right to emphasize that students aren't just blank slates, they're not empty vessels, sometimes they might minimize the role of the learning environment itself.
So the environment still matters a lot.
Right. It's about creating those conditions that really support that positive change.
Okay, so we've got this developmental approach, right? And then there's the other one focusing on thinking skills,
Right. The thinking skills approach is more about directly teaching specific skills that are believed to, well, make us better thinkers.
like practical tools for thinking.
Exactly. Things like critical thinking, higher order thinking, informal logic.
Right. The goal is to give students those specific abilities rather than relying on some underlying developmental process.
You got it. It's about equipping them with a toolkit of mental techniques, so to speak.
Okay, and what are the main assumptions of this approach? Like, how does it see the mind working?
Well, it often uses this sort of mechanistic view of the mind, kind of like a computer processing information.
Like, there are specific rules and procedures.
Exactly. And the way they see it, good thinking can be broken down into these identifiable skills.
So it can be analyzed and taught.
Right. And change, in this view, is seen as more exogenous. That means, like, coming from the outside.
So it's more about direct instruction shaping the mind from the outside.
Yeah. The idea is that we can program the mind to think more effectively by teaching these skills.
Got it. So it's a more direct and deliberate approach.
Exactly. And another big assumption here is that there's a common set of core thinking skills that apply, across the board, different people, different subjects, different situations.
Like a universal toolkit for thinking.
That's the idea.
All right, so what are the strengths of this thinking skills approach? What does it do well?
Well, one good thing is that it gives us those specific lists of skills that can be helpful, for defining what we mean by effective thinking.
So it provides some concrete targets.
Exactly. And it's led to some very clear teaching methods, ways to actually teach these skills and then assess whether students have learned them.
So it's got practical applications in the classroom.
Right. And even though terms like critical thinking can be, a little vague sometimes, this whole movement has definitely contributed to education. It's really highlighted the importance of explicitly teaching those thinking skills.
Okay, but, there must be some downsides or criticisms too, right?
Of course. While those lists of thinking skills can be handy, they're often based more on logic, formal and informal, or even just intuition, rather than some really solid empirical theory.
So there might be some gaps or biases in those lists.
Exactly. And it raises questions about, like, which skills are actually most important, and are these lists really complete?
Right. Do they capture the full picture of how we actually think?
And another thing is reducing thinking to just a set of skills might be too narrow.
Like there might be more to it than that.
Right. Even some thinkers within the critical thinking movement itself have pointed that out. Like Matthew Lipman, he argued that having thinking skills isn't that useful if you don't know when and how to use them.
So it's not just about having the tools, it's knowing when and how to use them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about judgment, context, all that. And this focus on direct instruction might also kind of overlook those internal factors we talked about earlier, development, the student's active construction of knowledge.
Right. So it might not fully capture the complexity of how we actually learn.
Yeah. Even if teaching thinking skills works to some extent, we shouldn't ignore those internal processes.
So we've got these two approaches, developmental and thinking skills. And it seems like they both have their strengths and weaknesses.
Right. They each offer valuable insights, but they come from pretty different perspectives.
And the article kind of points out that just trying to mash them together might not be so easy.
Yeah, because those underlying assumptions about knowledge and learning are pretty different. So instead of trying to force a complete integration, Moshman proposes this idea of rationality as a separate goal, a kind of middle ground.
Okay, so let's get into that. Rationality as an educational goal. What exactly do we mean by that? Like, how is it defined?
Well, Moshman defines it as the self-reflective, intentional, and appropriate coordination and use of genuine reasons in generating and justifying beliefs and behavior.
Okay, that's a mouthful. Maybe we can break it down a bit.
Sure. So the first key part is the appeal to reasons. It's not about acting on impulse or arbitrarily, or just because someone told you to.
You got to have good reasons behind your beliefs and actions.
Right. And not just any reasons. They need to be coordinated, make sense together, aim for consistency and coherence.
So if you've got conflicting beliefs or you're doing things without any justification, that's not very rational.
Exactly. And then there's the self-reflection and intentionality part.
Yeah.
Someone just blindly following a procedure, that's not really showing rationality.
Like they're not thinking for themselves.
Right. A rational thinker, they're aware of their own thinking, they're choosing to engage in it, they understand the purpose, and they can even reflect on how well they're doing.
Like thinking about thinking. Metacognition.
Right. It's not just about getting the right answer, but understanding why it's right and how you got there.
That makes sense. And the reasons themselves have to be genuine, right?
Exactly. They need to objectively support the belief or action, and the way you use them needs to be appropriate, in that specific context.
So not all reasons are created equal.
Right. And a big part of becoming more rational is learning to identify and value those good reasons and using them effectively.
Okay. And then the last part of the definition. Rationality isn't just about coming up with excuses after you've already done something, right?
Right. It's not about making up reasons after the fact.
You're not just trying to justify what you already did or believed.
It's about using reasons to actively generate new ideas, guide your actions going forward.
So it's a proactive way of thinking.
Exactly. And you can see how this idea of rationality is, more specific than just overall development, but broader than having a bunch of thinking skills.
It's kind of its own thing.
Right. And it gives us a framework for understanding why both development and learning specific skills are important.
Okay, so this definition of rationality seems pretty solid. But why should it be a major goal of education?
Well, the article gives three main philosophical arguments. First, rationality is a really good way to achieve positive outcomes.
Like, it helps us get what we want.
Right. Whatever your goals are, you're more likely to achieve them if you're thinking rationally, acting on good reasons.
Well, it's practical.
And this applies to individuals, but also to communities, to economic development, even to democracy.
Because a well-functioning democracy depends on citizens making informed, rational decisions.
Exactly. But then the second argument goes deeper. It says that rationality isn't just a means to an end, it's also an end in itself.
Like it's valuable in its own right.
Right. And it's tied to these core values like autonomy and dignity. We believe that individuals are autonomous beings. They have the right to make their own choices.
Right, that's a fundamental value.
But Moshman argues that autonomy without rationality is basically meaningless.
Because if you can't think for yourself, can you really be said to be making free choices?
Exactly. True freedom comes from the ability to reason, to form your own beliefs based on good reasons.
So it's not just about doing what you want, it's about being able to think for yourself and make choices based on reason.
Exactly. And then the third argument is about non-indoctrination.
That's a big one in education.
Right. Education always involves, introducing students to certain ideas and values. But if we just focus on transmitting information uncritically, that can be problematic.
Like, we don't want to just force our beliefs on students.
Exactly. And that's where rationality comes in. It gives students the ability to critically examine ideas, to form their own perspectives.
To think for themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
It's about empowering them to question, to evaluate, not just to accept whatever they're told.
That makes sense. But then you could argue, isn't promoting rationality itself a form of indoctrination?
That's a good point. But the article addresses that by emphasizing the self-reflective nature of rationality.
So it's not about imposing a set of beliefs.
Right. Rational thinkers are constantly questioning their own reasons, their own thinking processes.
They're open to revising their views.
Exactly. And this is especially relevant in public education, with the First Amendment and all that. We don't want the government dictating what students should believe.
Okay, so we've got these strong philosophical arguments for rationality as a goal. But how does it actually develop? What does psychology tell us?
That's the next big question. And while psychology has looked a lot at reasoning, Moshman points out that studying rationality specifically, as he defines it, is kind of a newer area.
So there's still a lot to learn.
Yeah. A lot of the traditional research focused on, whether people's reasoning matches formal logic.
Right, but rationality is more than just being logical.
Exactly. So the article lays out this proposed developmental path of rationality in three main areas: deduction, induction, and moral reasoning.
Okay, let's start with deduction. Drawing logical conclusions. How does that develop?
Well, even preschoolers, they can often reach the right deductive conclusions, but they don't seem to understand that they're actually drawing a conclusion.
It's more like they just arrive at the answer without really being aware of the process.
Exactly. But around 5 or 6, things start to change. They get more intentional, more self-reflective.
So they start to understand that they're reasoning, that they're drawing conclusions.
Yeah, they start to get that idea of logical necessity, that
Yeah.
some conclusions just follow logically from certain premises.
They realize that logic is a thing.
Right, and they start to see that you can gain new knowledge through inference, not just through direct observation.
It's a big step.
Then, around 11 or 12, there's another shift. They get this more explicit awareness of logical form.
So they're not just using logic, they're understanding it.
Right. They can tell the difference between the validity of an argument and whether the statements in it are actually true.
They're thinking about logic itself.
Yeah, and they can grasp these abstract concepts like tautologies and contradictions. Later on, in adolescence and adulthood, this ability keeps refining, and some people even develop this deeper metalogical understanding.
Like they're thinking about the nature of logical systems themselves.
Exactly. And throughout all of this, the key is this increasing capacity for intentionally and reflectively using deductive reasoning.
Okay, that's deduction. What about induction? Reasoning from evidence, making generalizations.
So similar to deduction, even little kids, they make inductive inferences. But they struggle with the idea of subjectivity, separating their own beliefs from reality.
They don't quite grasp that others might see things differently.
Right. But starting around 4, they start to get better at that. They understand different perspectives. They see the need for justification.
So they start to realize that their beliefs need to be grounded in something.
Exactly. And by elementary school, they're understanding how appearances can be deceptive, and that you need evidence to back up your claims.
Not just taking things at face value.
Right. Around 11, they start to really get the distinction between theories and data, and they start testing those theories, trying to find evidence that might disprove them.
So they're getting more skeptical, more rigorous in their thinking.
Yeah. And while this continues to develop, and it's not always consistently applied, some people eventually reach this really sophisticated understanding of how knowledge and justification work in inductive reasoning.
Okay, and the last area, moral reasoning.
Yeah.
How does our sense of right and wrong develop in this whole rationality framework?
Well, the article briefly mentions Kohlberg's stages of moral development, that progression from obedience and punishment to eventually universal ethical principles.
Right, becoming more principled in your moral reasoning.
Yeah. And each stage, it involves a more conscious reflection on the previous stage, leading to a deeper, more nuanced way of thinking about those moral dilemmas.
So you're not just following rules, you're thinking about the reasons behind them.
Exactly. And the article also talks about this thing called reflective abstraction. Basically, it's the process of consciously thinking about how you used to think.
Like looking back at your own mental development.
Yeah. By making those past assumptions explicit, you can reconstruct your understanding at a higher level.
So you're using your past thinking to build a better, more complex understanding.
Right. And this reflective abstraction is thought to be a key driver of how rationality develops.
Okay, now I'm thinking those who are really into teaching thinking skills, they might have some criticisms of this whole stage-based approach.
Yeah, that's a fair point. One criticism is that those developmental stages can be a bit vague, about the specific processes involved in thinking.
Like they don't always provide a clear picture of what's going on in the mind.
Right. And they might not give enough credit to the role of explicitly learning those thinking skills.
Because there's good evidence that you can teach those skills effectively.
Exactly. And that needs to be part of any complete theory of rationality.
So how does the article try to bring these different perspectives together?
Well, it argues that even though a purely stage-based view might not be the whole story, we can't just throw it out and focus only on teaching skills.
There's got to be some middle ground.
Right. One thing is, even when you successfully teach a thinking skill, it doesn't always transfer. Students might not use it in new situations.
So just having the skill isn't enough.
Exactly. And the article suggests that this is because learning a skill isn't passive. You're integrating it with your existing understanding, which brings us back to that constructivist idea.
The learner is actively making sense of things.
Right. And for a learned skill to really contribute to rationality, you need to understand why it works, What are the principles behind it? And you need to be able to choose when to apply it.
So it's not just blindly following a procedure, it's understanding it and using it strategically.
Exactly. Otherwise, the rationality is more in the teacher who designed the instruction, not in the student.
So it seems like the article is saying that both development and learning skills are important, and they're constantly interacting.
Yeah, it's more of a spectrum, with ongoing interplay between those internal processes and external learning.
And it gives that example of learning to test hypotheses by looking for disconfirming evidence.
Right. That's a skill you can teach, but it might go against a student's natural inclination to look for confirmation.
It can create a bit of cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. And that can actually push them to think more deeply about how knowledge works.
So learning can actually drive development.
Right. But development isn't just about piling up skills.
It's about that deeper understanding and integration.
Exactly. And another important point is the role of content knowledge. Both development and thinking skills approaches often assume that reasoning is pretty general across different subjects.
Like, if you can think well in one area, you can think well in any area.
Right. But that might not be the whole story.
Because there's this growing recognition of how important expertise is, having deep knowledge in a specific field.
Exactly. Like, to really solve problems in physics, you need a good grasp of physics concepts.
But content knowledge matters a lot.
Right, but it's not like we're going back to that old idea of formal discipline, where studying Latin makes you a better thinker in general.
It's more nuanced than that.
Exactly. The current thinking is that both general reasoning and specific knowledge are important, and we need to figure out how they work together.
It's about finding that balance.
Right. And even if you have deep knowledge in a particular area, for your reasoning to be truly rational, the article says there are some conditions.
What are those?
First, that body of knowledge needs to be well justified itself.
It has to be based on solid principles and evidence.
Right. Second, the person using that knowledge needs to understand why it's considered justified. What are the reasons behind it?
So they need to understand the justification, not just accept it blindly.
Exactly. And third, they need to be applying that knowledge intentionally, thoughtfully.
It's not just about having the knowledge, it's about using it wisely.
Right. The article uses this example of a student solving physics problems.
Okay, walk me through that.
So this student's using modern physics principles and equations, right? They're using well-justified knowledge.
But that's not enough for it to be truly rational.
Right. They also need to understand why those principles are valid, that they come from centuries of scientific inquiry, a process of testing and revising theories.
They need to understand the scientific method, the whole tradition of rational inquiry that led to that knowledge.
Exactly. And they need to be choosing to apply that knowledge appropriately, aware of its limitations. Otherwise, it's kind of like a sophisticated but unthinking response.
So rationality is about more than just knowing stuff or having skills. It's about understanding where that knowledge came from and using it thoughtfully.
Precisely. And the article concludes that rational thinking involves this constant back and forth between those general reasoning capacities and the specific content knowledge.
You need both working together.
Right. And you need to be mindful of how you're applying that knowledge and understand those underlying principles.
Okay, so let's say we all agree that rationality should be this big goal of education. What does that actually look like? What are the practical implications?
Well, the article doesn't lay out a specific curriculum, but it gives some general recommendations for different levels of education.
Okay, like what?
In preschool, the focus should be on encouraging kids to express their beliefs clearly and to give reasons for them.
Even if those reasons aren't, like, super accurate or complex.
Right. It's about getting them into the habit of justifying their thinking.
Building those foundations.
Exactly. Then, in elementary school, you can start introducing more systematic strategies for thinking. Drawing conclusions, evaluating beliefs, interacting fairly.
Laying the groundwork for more sophisticated reasoning.
Right. Secondary school is a big one because that's when they can really start grappling with those more abstract ideas, logic, hypothesis testing, moral principles.
Getting into the deeper stuff.
And then in higher education, you keep building on that, giving them more autonomy, pushing them to think about the nature of knowledge and ethics and all that.
So it's a gradual progression, building on each level.
Exactly. And in terms of where this focus on rationality should fit in, the article suggests doing both.
Like both teaching it as a separate subject and integrating it into other subjects.
Right. Integrating it into other subjects helps students see how rationality applies in different areas.
Like learning to evaluate evidence in science class or analyze historical arguments in history class.
Exactly. But having those dedicated courses on reasoning and critical thinking can also be really helpful.
To give them that more general, explicit understanding of rationality itself.
Right. So the two approaches can work together.
Now, how does this whole rationality goal connect with those broader aims of education, like teaching content knowledge, values, understanding traditions.
When it comes to content knowledge, their article argues that rationality requires more than just facts. You need that structured understanding, and you need to know how we arrive at that knowledge through rational processes.
So it's not just what we know, it's how we know it.
Right, and with values and morality, it's not about imposing a fixed set of values or just letting students believe whatever they want.
It's finding that balance.
Exactly. It's about promoting moral rationality, encouraging them to reflect on and justify their values.
And with traditions, it's not about blindly accepting or rejecting them.
It's about understanding them, critically evaluating them, and even rationality itself is a kind of tradition, a tradition of inquiry and critical thinking.
Right, it's a way of approaching the world.
Exactly. And then there are those more individual-focused goals like emotional development and creativity.
Yeah, does rationality help or hinder those?
Well, the article argues that rationality isn't about suppressing emotions. In fact, there are these rational passions, like valuing truth and objectivity.
So emotions can play a role in rational thinking.
Right. And with creativity, rationality is actually a key part of it. It's about evaluating and refining those new ideas.
So it's not just about coming up with wild ideas, it's about shaping and refining them.
Exactly. And developing those higher forms of rationality can be seen as a creative act in itself.
So to sum it all up, the main point here is that rationality should be this central goal in education. And looking at it through this lens can help us understand how those different approaches, like development and thinking skills, all fit together.
Right. And it highlights the importance of content knowledge and self-reflection and all that.
And ultimately, educating for rationality is about empowering individuals.
Giving them the tools to engage with the world and with their own thinking in a more meaningful way.
Right. It's about fostering those critical thinking skills and that deeper understanding.
Exactly. And one last thing to remember is that this whole process, it's not a straight line. It's not predictable.
It's an ongoing journey.
Right. And even the idea of rationality itself, it needs to be open to questioning and revision.
Because that's what real thinking is all about.
Mm,
Well, this has been a really thought-provoking deep dive. Definitely gives us a lot to chew on.
absolutely. Lots to think about.
Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.